we are going to talk this morning about managing inappropriate behavior and unsafe student behavior from the perspective of a preceptor. And I think it's kind of important for us to think about this topic in that the preceptor kind of forms a bridge and is really a critical link in getting the information from the clinical setting back to the educational school setting. So there's many roles in that bridge that we're going to talk through today. And so we're going to go ahead and get started. This presentation does have contact hours. And as before, you'll receive information at the end of the presentation. And when you return your evaluation to me, then I'll send you the certificate as a 0.5 contact hours for today for participating in the whole event. So first, we're going to talk about the safety aspect of this because safety is first. And so in this, the preceptors really have three jobs. The first one, the most important one, is to ensure patient safety, actually safety for the patient, the student themselves and the staff around. But remember when we were talking, we had gone through some information about Benner's model from novice to expert. And remember that when you're talking about a novice learner, you have to protect the safety aspect of their practice because they don't know enough yet to make those decisions themselves. Excuse me. Then the preceptor also has the job to challenge the students to learn and grow because, again, they're novice learners. And the third one, as Becky has talked about for a couple weeks now, was to evaluate the knowledge and competence of that novice learner. And so those are the three areas, and we're going to focus at safety today. So when you're considering this, as we said, there is safety for the patient, safety for the student themselves, and safety for the staff, because there's a lot of hazards in our area. There's a lot of things that can go wrong for all three aspects of this when a novice learner is in the environment. And so those are the things we're kind of going to talk through. As we know, mistakes do happen. So we need to understand the steps that are going to have to be taken whenever a mistake happens. And so first of all, make sure that everybody's okay. That's kind of a given. Everybody's going to do that first. But I want to talk for a minute about removing the student from the situation. Depending on the reaction of the student, the patient, the staff, you may need to remove the student. It's best if they can remain in the environment and learn how to work through the situation. That's part of the professional growth. But if the mistake is significant, if the student is extremely upset, if the staff or patient is extremely upset at what's happened, you probably need to remove the student from that immediate situation. And so I want you to think about now where you would remove the student to. They need to be able to go to somewhere that's basically empty and safe because you can't go with them right now. Your first priority is the patient. So you need to be able to have them go somewhere that is also a safe location for them. So think about that now. Gee, I would send a student to the break room, or I would send a student wherever. And then, maybe you can have someone go with them, but right now your priority is the patient or the immediate urgent situation. One thing I do want to caution you is don't let them leave. Don't make them go home. I've had preceptors do that. Oh, I sent them home. We just needed them out of here today. That's not safe for the student. The student is not in an emotionally safe situation when the situation requires them to leave. So safe place within your environment is where you need to go because you don't want to put them in danger. You have follow-up you're going to have to do with this. There's documentation that's going to be needed and that you do need to re-engage them with. So just some thoughts on that. Second, after things have settled down, you want to talk to the patient about what happened and why. And as you have that conversation, and this is really going to build the foundation for what we're going to talk about for the remainder of today, did they know the right thing to do? In this conversation, you're not yelling at them for what happened. You're just talking to them about what happened on a professional level. Did they know the right thing to do? And did they choose not to do the right thing? Two very critical things for you to have an understanding of. And the student, often the student gets an aha moment here. The third part of that conversation is collectively and probably as part of your responsibility to your facility, analyze determine the severity of the outcome. How bad did this error, how bad did the error get? Did it cause patient harm? Did it cause an explosion in the back room? Whatever happened, how bad was it? And is there a pattern? Is there a frequency of errors from this student? Or just as important, with this type of task? You might say, wow, don't feel bad, Susie. That same thing happened to 2 of our staff the last month. Those types of things in this conversation are extremely revealing and help the student understand how to process errors. And finally, the last thing is to document and report both your facility's reporting structure and the college's reporting structure, which usually includes the faculty. It is really important at this point that you normalize this documentation and reporting as part of professional role. Make sure to include the student. You are not reporting them. You're reporting all the aspects that led up to this error. Sometimes it's about them and sometimes it's about the system, as we're going to look at. So it's real important for us to understand the categories of errors that students can be involved with. First of all, there are intentional repetitive errors, and those are areas that the individual student has to take accountability for. Was there a lack of hand hygiene, poor PPE use, incomplete documentation? Those are things they should know and should have mastered. And if they're intentionally skipping them and intentionally repeating them, that's one level of problem. Then there is errors in knowledge and learning. And in this, the school and the preceptor have some responsibility and can help. So maybe this is, they're just not quite there on medication dosing or procedural understanding or their assessment facts, lab values, those kinds of things. The school really has resources that can be utilized to help prevent future errors in this category. And then the third type of errors that we see in everybody, but in students, mental slips and communication errors. And here's where the preceptor really takes a front line in helping prevent these types of errors, because the preceptor needs to watch and guide. Again, these are novice learners. So an example of these might be a breach in sterile field or incomplete handoff. These things aren't, they're not intentional. They didn't come that day saying, yeah, I'm going to break that sterile field. And they know how to do it. They've demonstrated competence in the lab or in the clinical setting. So it's just one of those normal mental slips, oops moments. And then the third one is that system failure. And this is where the facility really has to be part of the fix. Those might be medications aren't available and it impacts the timing. And so there's an error there. Incorrect patient education is printed from the EMR. Those types of things where it really is a system problem that led to the error. So when you think about errors, I think it's real important for schools, faculty, preceptors to make sure that we're introducing and using the concept of just culture whenever there's an error. Was the task understood? Was the action intentional? Was the result intentional? Those are key questions we're going to look at. And just culture, if you're not familiar with it, and to really oversimplify it, it's a balance between a culture of blame and punishment and a culture of no blame and no accountability. And those are two, historically, those are two ways that employers and healthcare facilities have looked at errors. Sometimes they just don't want to deal with it. And so, well, we're not going to put blame. We're just going to keep moving forward. And that's part of what led to all the errors in healthcare. And so just culture is that middle ground, that balance. And we're not going into just culture. That would take us about 2 or 3 of these sessions just to go through that. I do want to show you, however, the algorithm, or a simplified part of the algorithm. And we're just going to look at a couple of questions to let you see where the questions I've already talked about fit in here. So again, because it is such an important part of healthcare today, I think it's real important that preceptors kind of use the same mental framework when you're dealing with a student who is making errors. And so the first question is, was the job understood? We're going back to the learning issues here. Did they really understand what they were supposed to do? Or was there an effect of a defect in their training or in how we've placed them into the experiential part of learning? So those are 2 really important things to consider. And then the next ones would be, was the action intended and was the outcome, the result intended? And if those are no's, then did the person knowingly violate procedure? And is there a history, a tendency, a pattern of violating procedures? And you can see that each of these lead to a different way to handle the errors. So if you're seeing errors, you have an unsafe student, right? That's part of this whole correlation. And so this is a mental framework and actually a risk management framework that many facilities are using. And I think it's important for preceptors to be speaking the same language and thinking in the same way. So there was a research article in 2008 on the tendency for unsafe behaviors and how you could recognize those early. And the first part of that is the student showing poor organization. Are they just always coming in unorganized? Possibly they're coming in overconfident or unmotivated to learn. Those are really opposite ends of the spectrum, but they both tend to lead to errors and unsafe behaviors later. Do they not accept feedback? Becky has spent a couple weeks now talking about different aspects of feedback and communication, which really feed perfectly into these next two. If the student, when you're giving them those formative feedback comments, if they're just always resisting that and always saying yes, but, or those types of things, that is kind of a heads up, a little red flag for future unsafe issues that are going to happen. And then inappropriate verbal and nonverbal communication. Those are also, just that their attitude is not in the learning mode. And again, one of the important things for you to think through as you start to see even these type of behaviors, is this a single entity? Did this just happen today and this is not their normal, or is it a pattern? If it is a single action, then you really need to kind of pull them aside, if you can, hopefully, and have an immediate conversation with them. Because, maybe something just really bad happened in their life and their brain is not there that day and they just need to take the day off. Something's going on that caused this to be a single event to where they're misorganized or unmotivated or what all those things were. If it is a pattern, however, then you continue the formative feedback, but you also need to engage the faculty because these are precursors to unsafe behaviors, and we don't want any of those errors to hit the patient level. So as I was looking at this topic, I thought, we really do need to look at the legal foundation for this bridge that I'm kind of going to refer to in a few minutes, this communication bridge that preceptors play. So I went to the Ohio Board of Nursing and looked at some of the legal aspects of safety in the clinical setting. And I wanted you to be aware, because I didn't know how formal it was until I did a little reading. I wanted you to be aware that schools, all the programs of nursing, have to track and report issues related to student conduct and student clinical performance. And so I think that's real important because you're the person as a preceptor, you're the person that's going to see these. And if you don't report them, they can't track and report them then to the Ohio Board. So I think it was real important to just kind of mention that to you. And then I want to talk about the definition of a preceptor. And again, this is a legal definition. OAC is the Ohio Administrative Code. So that's the rules that govern nursing. And within that definition, it says that the preceptor will provide supervision to the student and will implement the clinical education plan at the direction of the faculty. So it's real important that you know what that education plan is so you can implement it. That's actually part of the law and rules that govern your practice. And then the qualifications also written in those rules say that the preceptor will demonstrate competence. And in the Momentum issue of summer of 2020, they actually went on to explain that part of that demonstrated competence is to have the knowledge, skill, and abilities to ensure safe and effective supervision of the student's nursing practice. So again, I think that's real important that you understand you actually have a license-based legal requirement to engage in the safety aspects of your student's practice. And then both the student and the preceptor are held responsible for maintaining the safety standards that are written in the rules. And those include promoting a safe environment for each patient, maintaining professional boundaries, and not engaging behavior that could be interpreted as physical, verbal, mental, or emotional abuse. So those are just kind of the framework that I wanted to make sure that you understood as we go into some of the communications and how you're actually going to manage this unsafe or unprofessional behavior. So let's look at a different way to categorize or put the types of errors that you'll have to deal with and the preceptor role then for each of these. So if we have a deficit in knowledge or skill, those are again things like procedural, organization, following directions. The preceptor really, this is again going back to that novice, how to move novices along, and you're going to monitor and provide formative feedback. Those are kind of expected. You kind of know going in. You got a learner beside you that might not know everything yet. And then the next kind of error that you'll see, unsafe issue that you'll see, comes from the attitude. And so they can be overconfident, unmotivated, uninterested, won't accept feedback, as we said earlier. And so the preceptor here, the responsibility is to continue to provide formative feedback, but also now here's the bridge to start bringing in faculty involvement, because there are resources in the colleges and I want to say rules or standards that they need to impact to help form the attitude of that student. Remember, one of the goals is student success. And if we don't help them shape that professional attitude, they're not going to be successful. And then we get all the way into unprofessional behavior. And unprofessional behavior can include the things we mentioned earlier of verbal or nonverbal communication, being disrespectful, arguing, poor work ethic, dishonest, and even intentional unsafe practice. So here again, this is where those are just totally not acceptable behaviors. We would remove the student from the setting. We would say, look, this is what we're seeing, and you can't talk to the doctor or the patient or me or whomever that way. This is not how we behave in a professional manner. And therefore, we're not going to have you in this environment today. And then so that's given in the form of formative feedback, what's going on and what's the repercussions of that. And then when you communicate to the faculty, there's really going to be faculty action now. It's not just supportive for the student, but it is really corrective for the student when you see those types of behavior in a clinical setting, those types of behaviors anywhere from a professional student. So the communication is really critical here. It is important that you communicate as soon as you see the issue. And that ensures the ongoing patient safety. It ensures the student receives the right education and support, again, for their success. And it also preserves two relationships that sometimes get a backseat. And I think it's real important for us to think about that student and preceptor relationship, because you may still have that student with you for a number of weeks. But it also helps preserve that facility and school relationship. All it takes is 2 or 3 bad instances in a clinical setting for the clinical setting to say, we don't have time, effort, and energy for this. We're no longer going to take those students from that program. And we don't want that to happen. We need those clinical settings. So it is really important for that communication to be early and professional so that we can maintain those relationships. One aspect of communication I do want to highlight for you, however, do not talk to your boss or your peers for input or thoughts about a student issue. They have a right to privacy, and the breach of that right to privacy is a problem. And that comes under the Federal Education Rights and Privacy Act. So we're very familiar with HIPAA. Students have an act called FERPA. So I'm having this issue. I think the student has a bad attitude. What am I going to do about it? You don't go to your boss and say, you've had students a lot. Can you help me with this? That isn't inappropriate. You can't use the student and talk about your student to your boss. You can talk about students in general. You can talk about, I've got this novice learner. What would you do in this instance? You can keep things very de-identified, but do not talk about specific student issues that can be identified back to the student. And be careful, if you only have one student in the setting, especially like in an outpatient primary health setting, it's really easy to say, oh, it's that student. So we have to be really careful about that. Now, if an error does happen, if an injury, et cetera, does happen, you obviously have to then follow all your facility policies, fill out all the reporting errors, and in that instance, you can identify the student. That's not part of it. But just to go and talk for advice, or that back kind of conversation about, oh, you wouldn't believe what so-and-so did, those things are actually against the law. So we have to be careful about those. And then I want to just spend a minute talking about a concept that I thought was extremely interesting, and that is a failure to fail. And this happens commonly for preceptors and for new clinical faculty. And the reasons are varied. It can be, boy, I'm just not sure. Is that something I should talk to the faculty about? Or is it just, I'm just not sure about that error or that problem? It could be, I really like Susie. We get along so well. I really enjoy when she's here with me. I don't want to screw that up. I'm just going to let this go. it could be, I don't have time to deal with this. This is going to mean I have to fill out more forms and I have to wait and chase the faculty and we have to make an appointment. I just don't have time for this. I'm going to let that go. So all of these things lead to a failure to correctly and adequately support the student now and protect the future. So we always have to consider the ongoing safety of future student or future patients and the competence that that student needs for future success. And those things get threatened when we fail as teachers, when we fail to fail a student. So I just wanted to put that concept out there because I think it kind of summarizes a lot of the issues that keep going. And I know that we are just about at time. So I wanted to find out from all of you guys if you have any questions or comments or example of this. It was a little heavy in content and not as heavy in discussion, but we do have a few minutes left. So anybody on the call, what do you think about some of these aspects of handling the inappropriate behavior and safety aspects that can come up when you have students in the setting?
Well, while Mary and Cheryl might be unmuting themselves, I had a question about the FERPA issue. So I have received calls from management in this COVID time where students have not been either wearing their mask or keeping social distance. And so it went from, it was observed by a physician in the setting. I'm sure they said something at the time, but then it went to the nurse management and then it came back to me and then I had to say something to the student. I was wondering about if FERPA played in there or if, this was okay.
It's probably on the side of following the facility's policy. So they're trying, the physician is probably not the one supervising the student. They just observe something in the clinical setting. I don't know that that would actually be a breach in FERPA. I think that would be following a typical reporting structure of communication.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great, thanks.
I am not an expert on FERPA, but that would be my hunch.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I do have one question. Can you consult with the faculty member and maybe have the faculty member come in and observe? Oh,
absolutely. Absolutely. That's really one of the roles that they're required under the role of a faculty under the law. They are absolutely part of the clinical team. And when these issues occur and that preceptor comes first part of that bridge and says, okay, faculty, I'm doing my part and I'm following your education plan and here's the issue I've identified. Then the faculty comes across the other side of the bridge and says, okay, now what are we going to do about this? And so it really does come from both sides of the, the issue to form that bridge and make sure that all the communication and all the resources that student needs and all the resources the facility needs to maintain safety can be accessed. So yes, absolutely. The faculty can and should be in that clinical setting if needed.
This is Cheryl. I haven't had any problems with errors necessarily. The only thing that touched base with me in the beginning of your talk was the documentation. Sometimes I find the students' documentation very weak, and I just think it's just a learning experience, and they just need more experience and more coaching on correct documentation.
Yep. And so that type of documentation area you're talking about there is that lack of knowledge and skill deficit. And
Correct.
So that just ongoing monitoring that you mentioned, and then the feedback to the encouragement, that's perfectly normal. And I guess the only thing then that would highlight a need for communication and documentation on your part as the educator in that moment would be if it becomes repetitive. Because if it becomes repetitive, then we're back into the type of error, and I don't think I can get back there quickly without a lot of issues. I won't try. But when it becomes repetitive, then it moves to where you might need to engage the faculty some to get their help, because then it really does kind of move into that attitude. But a normal, just their documentation's weak and they're growing those skills and they're learning, that's perfectly normal in that knowledge and skill deficit area.
Correct. And then most of the schools do come and observe their students at least once through the semester or once through the rotation. They usually set that up in the beginning and come midway to see how the students are doing and do an observation day.
Right. And that's, again, that's very normal in that educational plan. But if there are issues that are identified before and after that visit, then most faculty will arrange to get back in the clinical setting and observe what's going on during additional days or additional times at least. Yeah, and faculty are stretched pretty thin in some of those, so sometimes it takes a little planning for them to get there. But depending on the severity of what's going on, they typically are very good about reprioritizing and getting there when they're needed.
And also, I just wanted to share a little story. We had a student who made an error in the clinical setting, and the student kind of got blamed for the error. And then they sent the student home. And the student came back to the school of nursing and kind of met with me and was really crying and very upset. And it turned out it really wasn't the student's error. It turned out it was like a systems error that the student kind of just got involved in. So we did a root cause analysis with the student and then with the faculty member and the staff at the hospital, and really turned out to be a great exercise in really understanding system errors. But this also made me think about the whole second victim issue. That sometimes nurses get involved in these errors and it's not their fault. They get blamed, but then they get labeled, they're sort of not labeled, but they're a second victim to the system. And there's a lot of literature in that area now also. But this was a great topic. Thank you so much.
Yeah, the second victim is indeed part of this whole thing. And again, just time's sake, didn't go into all of that. But back in the beginning, when we talked about don't send the student home, there's things that need to happen, and really getting preceptors in that clinical setting to understand the just culture and trying to really understand, was this an intentional or an unintentional? Was it their issue or was it a system issue? Those basic key questions there really can help protect the student from being that second victim. We have to do some really strong work in normalizing that professional approach to error investigation and error handling, because right now we're still kind of tearing apart students in that. I've had lots of experience where preceptors just made the student feel like it was all their problem, and it wasn't. It wasn't. In many instances, it was not, or it was something that we should expect and protect them from, one or the other. So.
Barb, I wanted to kind of.
Yeah, go ahead.
And I just want to extend one of the things that Cheryl said earlier, which was the repetitive nature. So you have repetitive within the same student. And I think we've talked about that, but I think the thing that when Cheryl said it, it reminded me of if it's repetitive between students. And maybe then there's this extra step where the facility and the school, or the preceptor and the faculty, have to have additional conversation about how do we set the students up for success that come to your facility? And do we have to take another step there in kind of prepping them for their experience? I don't know.
Yep. I would agree wholeheartedly. I think that goes into identifying those trends, not only, like you said, with one student, but across, and then back into quality improvement to say, what are we going to do to improve this overall situation? We now have this recorded. So again, there's so much about this whole aspect of kind of paying attention, keeping track, and communicating that so that the trends can be seen across students. Maybe it's even across facilities. But, so often the preceptor kind of gets a little bit stuck in, you have our student, we'll be there in the middle of the semester and check on them once, but not a lot of communication before and after that one single event. And so I think throughout everything that I read for this, that everybody highlighted that ongoing communication between preceptor and student and preceptor and faculty. So I would say any takeaway would be that.